10%. Now, it might sound like a fraction, a pretty manageable slice, but when you apply that to a nation-state, it is a massive, absolutely world-altering figure. Right now, Israel is pushing a military campaign aiming to seize control over roughly 10% of Lebanon's entire sovereign territory. It is a striking number, and it sits at the very heart of a crisis that is quietly threatening to permanently redraw the borders of the Middle East. Welcome to The Explainer. I am so glad you're joining us today. We're going to untangle a highly complex, rapidly evolving geopolitical earthquake, the Litani River crisis. Now, if you've been following the news, you know there is a lot of noise out there. There are competing narratives, deep historical baggage. It's a lot. My goal today is to cut right through that noise. We're going to impartially break down the geography, the history, and the incredibly fragile politics driving this conflict, so you can truly understand what is at stake. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The Litani River Offensive. 2. Decades of unresolved conflict. 3. Lebanon's fragile balancing act. 4. The humanitarian crisis. 5. Israel's unknown endgame. And 6. 3 potential scenarios. Okay, let's jump right into Section 1. The Litani River Offensive. Let's dive into this and look at the actual geography of what's happening on the ground right now. The current Israeli military objective is highly specific. They want to push the heavily armed paramilitary group Hezbollah entirely out of southern Lebanon and secure a buffer zone extending all the way up to the Litani River. That river sits roughly 30 kilometers, or about 19 miles, deep into Lebanese territory. Taking control of that area is exactly what creates that massive 10% territorial footprint we talked about at the start. To make this happen, the Israeli military ordered evacuations, pushing massive populations northward. We're talking about some 600,000 Lebanese residents fleeing from below the Litani River, and another 400,000 evacuating from areas further north, as well as the southern suburbs of Beirut. Moving on to Section 2. Decades of unresolved conflict. To really grasp why this exact 30-kilometer stretch of land is the epicenter of so much destruction, we have to look at the cyclical nature of this conflict. It's like a perpetual loop. Back in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon in response to militant attacks, and they occupied a swath of the south to act as a buffer zone. Well, that occupation sparked the creation of Hezbollah, a Shiite resistance militia heavily backed by Iran. Israel eventually withdrew in the year 2000. But Hezbollah? They remained heavily armed. They fought another war in 2006, which ended with UN Resolution 1701. The absolutely crucial point here is that Resolution 1701 explicitly called for Hezbollah to withdraw north of the Litani River and disarm. But for nearly 2 decades, that never happened. Then, following the attacks of October 2023, Hezbollah decided to join the war by firing rockets into northern Israel, which ended up dragging the whole region right back into full-scale conflict. Which brings us to Section 3, Lebanon's Fragile Balancing Act. Now, all of this begs a pretty massive question, right? If the UN demanded Hezbollah disarm way back in 2006, why didn't the Lebanese central government just enforce it? Well, it all comes down to a really delicate, convoluted power-sharing system. You have a demographic split of 55% Muslim, which is evenly split between Sunni and Shiite, then 40.5% Christian across various sects, and 4.5% Druze. Between 1975 and 1990, Lebanon suffered a devastating 15-year civil war that killed over 100,000 people. To stop the bleeding, they created this incredibly strict sectarian balance of power. For example, the president must be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of parliament a Shiite Muslim. Enforcing Resolution 1701 and trying to forcibly disarm Hezbollah, that risks completely shattering this fragile demographic peace and throwing the country right back into civil war. And beyond the fear of civil war, there is a stark mathematical reality here. Hezbollah functions essentially as a state within a state. They wield an estimated annual budget of around $1 billion, with about 700 to 800 million of that directly provided by Iran. Contrast that with the official Lebanese armed forces, who operate on just $635 million. Hezbollah maintains an army roughly the same size as the national one, but their fighters are generally better paid, better equipped, and they possess a lot more actual combat experience. So, the central Lebanese government is effectively trapped in this agonizing dilemma. If they confront Hezbollah, they risk a domestic revolt among the Shiite population and a brand new civil war. Plus, honestly, they probably wouldn't win a military confrontation anyway. But if they remain totally passive, they face immense collateral damage from vastly superior Israeli military strikes, and they risk losing hundreds of millions in military funding from the United States. Because of this, the historic strategy of the Lebanese government has basically been to do nothing at all. Every single action carries catastrophic risk. Let's look at the human cost in Section 4, the humanitarian crisis. While the government remains paralyzed, the citizens of Lebanon are bearing an unbelievable cost. Over 1 million people. That is the number of residents forcefully displaced in Lebanon right now. It is the largest forced displacement in the country's entire modern history, affecting roughly 1 in 6 people. Because these displaced civilians are overwhelmingly from the Shiite community in the south, seeking refuge in Christian, Sunni, and Druze majority areas is creating massive demographic strain. We're seeing paranoid local communities vetting or outright turning away displaced families, out of a fear of putting a target on their own backs from Israeli airstrikes targeting Hezbollah members. And to truly understand the stakes, you have to realize this massive displacement builds on a foundation of absolute ruin. Lebanon wasn't stable before this war, not at all. In 2019, they suffered a financial collapse that wiped out 90% of their currency value and 40% of their GDP. Then, in 2020, the catastrophic Beirut port explosion killed over 200 people and caused $8 billion in damages. And now, on top of the whole shebang, this renewed conflict brings over 1 million displaced citizens and widespread infrastructure destruction. This is a nation already stretched far beyond its breaking point. Next up, Section 5, Israel's unknown endgame. So we know what's happening on the ground, but what is the ultimate goal here? This is where things get truly opaque. The official defense establishment line in Israel is straightforward but vague. The Israeli defense minister has stated this is an open-ended mission to establish an Israeli-controlled buffer zone south of the Litani River. They've declared that none of the displaced residents will be allowed to return until the security of northern Israel is completely ensured. To pull this off, the military strategy involves bulldozing and completely demolishing border villages to root out Hezbollah infrastructure. Crucially, though, they have established absolutely no clear timeline for how long this occupation might last. However, if you listen to the rhetoric coming from inside the Israeli cabinet, it hints at a far more permanent outcome. Consider this explicit statement from Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who said that the new Israeli border needs to be expanded up to the Litani River. This isn't just talk of a temporary buffer zone. This is an argument for formal annexation. For some historical context, Israel occupied the Golan Heights from Syria back in 1967 as a buffer zone, eventually allowed settlers in, and then formally annexed the territory 14 years later in 1981. A lot of people are looking at that precedent right now. Naturally, this rhetoric has triggered some severe anxieties within Lebanon. The Lebanese fear a permanent occupation and forced demographic changes, effectively ethnic cleansing. And this fear is amplified by current Israeli military tactics. They have actively bombed and destroyed every single major bridge crossing the Litani River. Now, while Israel says this is simply to stop Hezbollah from moving weapons, it effectively isolates South Lebanon logistically. Without those bridges, humanitarian aid can't easily get in, and the hundreds of thousands of displaced refugees literally cannot cross back over to their homes. That makes long-term control over the area significantly easier to manage. Finally, let's look at Section 6, 3 potential scenarios. So with all this data on the table, where do we actually go from here? First, there is the unlikely withdrawal. Israel could eventually pull back due to mounting casualties or international pressure, though historical trends suggest this is pretty improbable in the near term. Second, we could see a land trade for recognition. Israel might use South Lebanon as a bargaining chip, trading it back to the Lebanese government in exchange for formal recognition and a firm, verified commitment to rein in Hezbollah. This kind of mirrors the 1980s deal, where Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. And third, the most escalatory path, indefinite occupation leading to annexation. Believing the buffer zone is just too critical to ever abandon, Israel could maintain long-term military control, eventually moving settlers in, just like that Golan Heights model we discussed. Which brings us to our final overarching question. Can Lebanon actually survive another redrawing of its borders? We've seen the incredible fragility of its government, the total devastation of its economy, and 1 million of its citizens forced from their homes. Whether this ends in a treaty, an endless occupation, or a formalized annexation, Lebanon is being pushed dangerously close to the brink of complete state collapse. And if that happens, the geopolitical calamity will ripple far, far beyond the borders of the Middle East. It's a complex, deeply challenging topic, but understanding these dynamics is absolutely crucial. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, keep looking closely at the facts, and I'll see you next time.